Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 11th of March 2024. Let's get straight to the military aid and equipment section. Poland's Duda, he's a president there, and Donald Tusk are to visit. But actually, they're both from very different ends of the political spectrum, the Prime Minister and the President. They're both to visit the US to lobby for Ukraine. This is very important because it shows a unified front in Poland. However, I don't know how useful this is, or it will be in the US, because those who support Ukraine openly support Ukraine, and those who openly don't support Ukraine are almost certainly going to have something called a backfire effect, which is where you entrench in your original position even more strongly given the onslaught of contrary evidence and rationale against your position. So rather than change our minds, we're not very good at doing that. We'll just get even more defensive and even more prickly and then push back even more. And so when you have foreign dignitaries coming to the US, and not for the first time, the UK has done this. David Cameron's tried to do this, and Marjorie Taylor Greene told him to go and stick it, basically. So when you have foreign dignitaries come across and say, no, you really should be doing this and not that, the sorts of people whose minds you want to change are the people whose minds will most entrench in a position against that advice. But nonetheless, I guess it depends how this is couched, how it's done. You can but try it, I guess. Polish President Andrzej Duda and Prime Minister Donald Tusk will visit the US on March the 12th, so that's tomorrow, on the 25th anniversary of Poland's NATO accession, to advocate for US military aid to Ukraine. Good luck to them. Petr Pavel says that Ukraine will receive 800,000 shells in the coming weeks. So the idea that 300,000 have been paid for already and the rest of the money will come. Actually, it's more bullish than that today, yesterday, saying that this will happen, quote, if there are no fundamental problems. So, all things going well, they should get an awful lot of shells, but he did not disclose which countries could supply such a quantity of ammunition. And there's talk about it being more than 800,000 if they get the full whack of the money. And then we come on to the German foreign minister here stating that the Taurus Ringtausch, which is the rotation, the exchange, where the idea was that, and this is what David Cameron had proposed, or the British had proposed, which is you give us Taurus missiles, we upgrade from Storm Shadow to Taurus in the UK, and the UK will give Ukraine Storm Shadow missiles. So you give us Taurus, we'll give them Storm Shadows. The Ukrainians won't get Taurus this way, but they will get Storm Shadows. I wonder whether somewhere down the line, the UK get enough Storm Shadows that we go, and we're giving them Storm Shadows, screw you, Germany, or whether Germany will put a stop on that through some kind of export restriction. So anyway, it's explicitly on the table and somewhat implied, in my opinion, says Fabian Hoffmann, that it is increasingly a likely option. And this is coming from the foreign minister who talked about it on national TV. So this might be coming. The UK gets Taurus, Ukraine gets Storm Shadow. So German aid to Ukraine says German foreign minister has just become the first important member of the German government to show herself open-minded to a Ringtausch with the UK, for example, which would mean a delivery of Taurus KPD 350s to the UK and a delivery of Storm Shadows to Ukraine in return. If understood correctly, talks are already underway behind closed doors. Very significant. More than a year ago, Canada promised to deliver a $406 million missile system to Ukraine. This is the NASAMS has been caught up in the US. Now, Canada been given a hard time for this because they still haven't managed to get it to Ukraine. But they're saying it's not our fault, it's the US. But the acquisition is being delayed by US bureaucracy, said National Defense Minister Bill Blair. I don't know what the real reason is and why it can't be done as quickly as it hasn't been done. But nonetheless, the Canadians there are blaming the US for that. Now, talking about F-16s, a new training centre in Romania created to teach Ukrainian pilots, and of course NATO, it's not just for Ukrainian pilots, it's for NATO pilots as well, to fly F-16 warplanes, is awaiting the arrival of Ukrainian pilots. The Fortesti Air Base, where the centre is located, is also being used by NATO allies for training on fighter jets, although 12 Ukrainian pilots are expected to be ready for combat by the summer after 10 months of training in Denmark, Britain and the US. Delays on the delivery of F-16s pose challenges. As few as 6 F-16s may be delivered out of the 45 promised by European allies by the time the trained pilots return to Ukraine. So there's a couple of things to talk about here. One, They haven't yet got to use the base in Romania to do the training, but they are looking like being ready, slightly ahead of the game, or as ahead as some people were possibly expecting. So sometime in maybe July, first batch of Ukrainian pilots will be ready. Actually, that's not too far away. Okay. Also, that only 6 planes are expected to be ready. Some people are saying, well, they better be the planes these planes had better have decent radar capabilities, decent weaponry. Hopefully they've been upgraded to a decent spec, because if you're going to throw Ukrainian pilots into F-16s that aren't as capable as they could be, then you're still possibly handing the advantage to the Russians, and you might then end up losing some F-16s, and it might be a bit of a PR disaster. Okay. Slightly different subject here. Investors are thirsty for these bonds, says Brian Manguero, a portfolio manager at Barings. Last month, a €3 billion bond received 81 billion euros in orders, the highest cover ratio ever recorded in Europe's publicly syndicated debt market. I wonder whether I don't really know enough about this economically speaking, but I guess it's good news that there is a demand for these bonds that will help raise money for Ukraine. As I mentioned in my previous video, Ukrainians review the Challenger 2, and this is coming from a reporter who's been embedded with these guys from The Sun. There are pluses and minuses with everything, and a minus is its mobility. So the Challenger 2 main battle tank, its ability to maneuver across ground. They keep getting stuck in the mud because it is so heavy. Such a challenge. These are 70-ton tanks. These are the heaviest tank in the world, pretty much. And trying to maneuver these across the very muddy ground, particularly this time of year, and in autumn, obviously autumn last year and next autumn. The challenge is mobility, given the heaviness of these tanks and the very muddy Raputitsa or Bezdrizhda, I think is how you pronounce it in Ukrainian. And then we have the Challenger squadron revealed to The Sun that only 7 of the 14 tanks donated are still fighting fit. A bigger problem is reliability. Sorry, I said 5 in my previous one. 5 have broken down. 7 are fighting fit. And spare parts from Britain that sometimes take months to arrive. And that, I guess, implies that 2 have been destroyed and abandoned. We know that at least one of them was. Kafarik 26 said his Challenger 2 crew had been regularly blasting targets about 4.5 kilometers away, but most of their missions were firing at Russian armored positions, including infantry bunkers and dugouts and vehicles. Absolutely, and that's what you expect them to be used for. They are very good against buildings because of the type of shell that they use in the Challenger. It's not smooth bore round, so they use these Hesh squash head rounds that are rifled, and they're particularly good against things like bunkers and dugouts compared to other top tanks. However, they won't be firing against top tanks either, so infantry fighting vehicles and all sorts of vehicles are fair game for these, and they have a really good range. So the Challenger, the good point is they're good at blowing stuff up at long distances. Bad point is that they keep getting stuck and they can't get the spare parts. So Mykola Bieliskov has said 2,000 kamikaze drones based on FPV technology, 50 power generators and 200 night vision equipment pieces to those who defend Ukrainian positions in the Zaporizhia region will be sent. Ukraine will defend itself while engaging from abroad. Otherwise, it's moral and strategic defeat of the West. Slightly butchered English here, but this is good news that still they are being provided an awful lot of kit by fundraising, by different organisations outside of the central government. And that's so important for Ukraine in a way that I don't think Russia are. I mean, it is really, really very important. Right. Exclusive here. Russia is producing, this is a great CNN article here, well worth reading. Russia is producing 3 times more artillery shells than the US and Europe for Ukraine. Okay, let's dip into this. Russia is producing about 250,000 artillery munitions per month, or about 3 million a year, according to a NATO intelligence estimate of Russian defense production shared with CNN. Now, recently it was claimed that they're moving up from 2 million shells to 2.7 million a year. I don't know whether that was, because that's, I'm pretty sure, what Russia stated themselves. And it could be from this intelligence that Russia are underselling what they're able to produce, and it's actually 3 million. I don't know. It's somewhere between 2 and 3 million, right? Anyway. As well as coming from sources familiar with the Western efforts to arm Ukraine. Collectively, the US and Europe have the capacity to generate only about 1.2 million munitions annually to send to Kyiv, and senior European intelligence has told CNN, an official. The US military set a goal to produce 100,000 rounds of artillery a month by the end of 2025, less than half of the Russian monthly output, which is good. And apparently, they're ahead of the game with that. The US are doing a really good job of ramping up. The problem is, you can build as much as you like, but if the Congress don't give you permission to send that to Ukraine, what's the freaking point? So it's all about Congress. Anyway, less than half of what the Russian monthly output is, and even that number is now out of reach with $60 billion in Ukraine funding stalled in Congress, a senior army official told reporters last week. So that may affect, that Congress bill might affect the production numbers inside the US, and they might not even be able to make that at the moment because of that stalled bill. It's so freaking frustrating. Quote, what we are in now is a production war, a senior NATO official told CNN. Quote, the outcome in Ukraine depends on how each side is equipped to conduct this war. Officials say Russia is currently firing around 10,000 shells a day compared to just 2,000 a day from the Ukrainian side. So that's broadly what I said months ago, and that's still the case. This is a very different state of affairs from the height of the Ukrainian counteroffensive when Ukraine overtook Russia. I think it was something like Ukraine were firing 9,000 a day and Russia about 7,000 a day. Russia have got it back up to 10,000. But remember, although that sounds terrible for Ukraine, actually compared to the beginning of the war or the height of the first of 2022, where Russia were expending something like 40,000 to 60,000 a day, that is still a quarter to a sixth of what they were firing. So 10,000 shells a day is much more than Ukraine, but much less than what they would like. The ratio is worse in some places along the 600-mile front, according to European intelligence official. Okay, the shortfall comes at perhaps the most perilous moment for Ukraine's war efforts since Russia first marched on Kyiv in February 2022. US money for arming Ukraine has run out, and Republican opposition in Congress has effectively halted giving any more. Meanwhile, Russia recently took the Ukrainian city of Avdiivka and is widely seen as having the initiative on the battlefield. Ukraine is struggling not just with ammunition, but also growing manpower shortages on the front lines. So that's all we know all about that, and hopefully that is changing with more ammunition coming to them. But again, how sustainable is that? Russia is running an artillery factories 24/7 on rotating 12-hour shifts, the NATO officials said. About 3.5 million Russians now work in the defense sector, up from somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million before the war. Russia is also importing ammunition. Iran has sent at least 300,000 shells last year, probably more than that, the official said, and North Korea provided at least 7,600 containers of ammunition carrying millions of shells. Thoughts are there are around 3 million shells. Russia has, quote, put everything they have in the game, the intelligence official said. Their war machine works in full gear. A rough equivalent in the US would be if President Joe Biden invoked the Defense Production Act, a US official said, which gives the president power to order companies to produce equipment expeditiously to support the nation's national defenses. Russia's ramp up is still not enough to meet its needs, US and Western officials say, and Western intelligence officials do not expect Russia to make major gains on the battlefield in the short term. There is also a limit to Russian production capacity, officials say. Russian factories will likely hit a peak sometime in the next year, but it's still far beyond what the US and Europe are producing for Ukraine, especially without additional US funding. And then later on it goes, quote, the West is just starting their ramp up of building the infrastructure to add to the munitions capability that is needed. When the money was still flowing, the US Army expanded production of artillery in shells in Pennsylvania, Iowa, and Texas. But of course, now is that the case? Now the funding seems to have dried up and there's a stall in Congress. Quote, Russia's output is 24/7. I mean, huge, immense, one European lawmaker said. We should not underestimate their will to outlast us with patience and with resilience. And then later, Russia has also recently targeted Ukraine's domestic defense production with its long-range weapons. Quote, if we were talking about this last fall, we would have talked about how they were targeting critical infrastructure, the NATO official said. Now, what we see is some critical infrastructure targeting, but also a lot of targeting the Ukrainian defense industrial base. According to the senior NATO official, Russia is producing between 115 to 130 long-range missiles and 300 to 350 one-way attack drones, based on an Iranian model provided by Tehran each month. Although before the war, Russia had a stockpile of thousands of long-range missiles in its arsenal, today it's hovering around 700, the official said. The Russians have lately conserved those weapons to use in large volleys to try to overwhelm Ukrainian missile defences, and they have compensated by increasing their use of drones, sending out on average 4 times as many drones per month as they did last winter. Perhaps Russia's biggest challenge has been in tank and other armoured vehicle production. It's churning out about 125 tanks a month, but the vast majority are older models that have been refurbished. That's the key. We're not quite sure how many new tanks they're producing. So once they run out of those stocks, where are they at for producing new tanks? How sustainable is their replacement schedule? To continue, about 86% of the main battle tanks Russia produced in 2023 were refurbished, the NATO official said. And although Russia has about 5,000 tanks in storage, probably a large percentage of those can't be refurbished and are only good for cannibalizing parts. Moscow has lost at least 2,700 tanks, more than twice the total number that they deployed initially to Ukraine in February 2022 when the invasion began. And so, interesting article, lots to cogitate on in there, lots more I didn't read to you, well worth going to look at. Right, Russia has halved its arms exports, Ukraine leads importers. So Ukraine is one of the biggest importer in Europe. Russia has gone from, and I've talked about how this is the case for the last year, I've said that Russia will not be second in arms export anymore, and it will be France. And finally, someone's actually done the stats on this. So the war in Ukraine has had significant impact on the global arms trade. The United States traditionally ranks first in arms export, according to a report by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. France is in second place. The increase in French arms exports is mainly due to the delivery of combat aircraft to India, Qatar, and Egypt. Russia has moved into third place. Well, Russia's moving into third place because it's not exporting stuff, because it's using it all itself. And you're seeing our export variants of their tanks, like the T-90S, being blown up on the front line or captured on the front line or whatever. They are not exporting. They cannot afford to export stuff. They need to use everything themselves. And of course, as people look at how badly the Russian equipment is faring on the battlefront, they are not putting the orders in. So it's like a double whammy for the Russians. Huge issue, because it also affects their funding for the war going forward. Right. I've talked to you about this before. This is like, if this is true, like, I don't know if this is trolling. This could be Russians painting this stuff on and saying, let's do this because it's really divisive. Or it could be Americans doing this, in which case I'm freaking disgusted. Trump supporters paying for signed Russian shells is not something I expected to see, says Sofia Ukraini. In Dixieland, I'll take my stand, Fort Fisher Vintage Reserve, with the Confederate flag on there. F it, one struggle, Confederate flag and Russian flag. One of the Russian types of flags. Waiting for Tucker Carlson Putin interview is another one, with a handshake between Russia and US there with the flags. And then Trump, Make America Great Again 2024. These are painted on the side of shells, and supposedly, there is a website where you can do this. So like, it is up and running. So that I presume works, and it's a way of them funding their military endeavors. But if that is genuinely 4 sets of funders coming from the US to fund the Russian attack against Ukraine, it's pretty disgusting. And it's not just actually the US. So it's a raise a funding project to sign and draw on Russian shells. Instead of actually drawing, just do Photoshop, put the money cheerfully in his own pocket. Why is this pro-Russian faction always morally corrupt? So I don't know if this is actually real. These shells are real, whether someone's photoshopped these and has taken the money as said there. Nonetheless, there are Chinese who are paying to do this. F-Nazis and is that something imperialism? A love from China. I wish you victory for the Donbass people. And these are like Chinese for the Donbass people, for the Russians, I wish you victory. Fuck the Nazis and American imperialism. Love from China. And yet, the idea is you've got China talking about American imperialism, and then Americans helping out the Russians as well. And like, what's going on? I don't know. It's such a mess. And I guess more about that in the geopolitical update I'm going to do next. I have to split up these videos because I've got to go to the dentist now. It's going to be a very busy day due to loads of personal stuff for me to do. So I'll try and get my geopolitical video out in the afternoon at some point. Anyway, for the time being, take care. Toodle pips.